Have you ever noticed how your mind can turn a single harmless thought into an entire storm before the day has even begun? How one small mistake can replay in your head like a scene that refuses to end? How silence itself can sometimes feel louder than noise? And how exhaustion can exist even after doing absolutely nothing physical at all, because your brain never truly stops moving. You tell yourself to relax, to calm down, to stop overthinking. Yet the more you fight your thoughts, the stronger they become, as if your anxious brain has quietly learned to survive by keeping you trapped inside fear, prediction, worry, and mental noise. And maybe that is why you are here now, searching for a different way to think, a different way to breathe, a different way to exist inside your own mind without feeling attacked by it every single day. This audiobook is not simply about anxiety. It is about understanding the hidden system running underneath your thoughts, the invisible loops shaping your emotions, your habits, your reactions, your fears, and even the way you see yourself when nobody else is around. As you move through this journey, you will begin to understand why your brain keeps returning to stress, why overthinking feels automatic, why intrusive thoughts appear without permission, and why calm can sometimes feel unfamiliar even when nothing dangerous is happening. You will slowly uncover how anxiety is not randomness. It is conditioning, repetition, emotional memory, and survival wiring operating beneath awareness. The deeper you listen, the more you will realize that this book was designed like a gradual mental rewiring process, moving through different layers of the anxious mind. First helping you recognize the anxiety habit loop itself, then showing you how thought patterns create emotional reactions, how fear response becomes automatic behavior, how self-awareness changes the direction of the mind, and finally how emotional mastery and present moment awareness can begin transforming chaos into calm. What you are about to hear is not motivational fantasy. It is psychological understanding translated into human experience, practical enough to feel real, yet deep enough to change the relationship you have with your own mind. Because the truth is, anxiety rarely begins with reality itself. It begins with interpretation. One unanswered message becomes rejection, one uncertain outcome becomes disaster, one uncomfortable sensation becomes danger, and slowly the brain starts living inside prediction instead of presence. Your nervous system forgets how to rest because it believes constant thinking equals protection. The anxious brain convinces you that if you think hard enough, worry long enough, replay situations enough times, you might finally avoid pain. But instead, the opposite happens. You lose mental clarity, emotional energy, deep focus, and eventually even trust in yourself. And what makes this cycle dangerous is how normal it begins to feel. You wake up already tense, already scanning for problems, already preparing emotionally for things that have not happened yet. Your body sits in one room while your mind races through 10 different futures. Even moments meant for peace become opportunities for worry. Rest feels guilty. Silence feels uncomfortable. Happiness feels temporary. The brain becomes addicted to anticipation because uncertainty feels unsafe. But there is something important you must understand before moving further into this experience. Your brain is not broken. It is trained. And what has been trained can also be retrained. That realization changes everything. Because once you understand that anxiety is not your identity, but a pattern, you stop treating yourself like the enemy. You stop believing every thought deserves attention. You stop feeding mental noise with emotional energy. And little by little, you begin learning the art of observing thoughts without becoming controlled by them. This is where the real healing journey begins. Not in forcing positivity, not in pretending fear does not exist, but in recognizing how your mind has unconsciously built pathways around stress, overanalysis, and emotional survival. Every repeated fearful thought strengthens a pathway. Every catastrophic assumption reinforces emotional conditioning. Every moment spent trapped inside imagined danger teaches the brain to return there again tomorrow. And yet the opposite is also true. Every moment of awareness weakens the loop. Every calm response rewires emotional expectation. Every time you pause before reacting, you begin reclaiming thought control. That is the foundation of brain rewiring, not becoming emotionless, but becoming conscious enough to stop automatic fear from controlling your inner world. As this audiobook unfolds, you will start noticing your own patterns differently. You will see how anxiety speaks through urgency, how overthinking disguises itself as responsibility, how intrusive thoughts survive through resistance, and how emotional exhaustion often comes from fighting internal battles nobody else can see. You will begin recognizing how the mind creates stories faster than reality creates facts, and how most suffering is amplified not by the event itself, but by the meaning attached to it. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you will feel something unfamiliar begin to emerge underneath the noise. Space. A silent mind does not appear overnight, but awareness creates distance, and distance creates freedom. The moment you stop identifying with every fearful thought, the nervous system slowly begins to loosen its grip. Breathing changes. Attention changes. Emotional energy changes. The present moment becomes visible again, because peace was never hiding from you. Your anxious thinking was simply speaking too loudly to let you hear it. If you've made it this far into the introduction of Rewire Your Anxious Brain, before we continue the journey, please like this audiobook, share it, and subscribe to CliffNote Chronicles so this message can reach people who still don't know how to deal with anxiety. And with that, let's begin. What if the problem was never your life, but the cycle your mind keeps repeating inside it? The same fear, the same overthinking, the same emotional spiral replaying so many times that your brain now reacts before reality even has a chance to speak. Anxiety does not usually arrive like a sudden explosion. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, through small moments, a delayed reply, an uncertain future, a strange feeling in your chest, a memory from the past, a thought that whispers what if something goes wrong, and before you even realize it, your mind starts building an entire emotional storm around a possibility that does not yet exist. That is the cycle of anxiety, and the most dangerous part about it is how normal it starts to feel after living with it long enough. You wake up tired, not because your body worked too hard, but because your mind never truly rested. Even during silence, your thoughts continue moving, predicting, preparing, analyzing, replaying conversations, imagining failures, scanning for danger. Your anxious brain begins treating ordinary life like a constant emergency, and eventually your nervous system forgets the difference between real danger and imagined fear. This is where overthinking slowly transforms from a habit into an identity. You no longer say, "I have anxious thoughts." You begin saying, "This is just who I am." And without noticing it, the cycle tightens around you. The mind was designed to protect you, but anxiety changes that protection into obsession. Instead of helping you respond to life, it traps you in anticipation of life. You stop experiencing the present moment because your brain is too busy rehearsing painful futures. One thought creates another thought, which creates emotion, which creates physical tension, which creates more fearful thoughts, and suddenly your body believes the danger is real even when nothing is happening around you. Your heart beats faster, your breathing changes, your muscles tighten, and now your anxious brain says, "See, something must be wrong." The cycle feeds itself, and the harder you try to force the thoughts away, the stronger they often become. You tell yourself not to think about failure, and suddenly failure becomes all you can think about. You try not to panic, and your body becomes hyper-aware of every sensation. You attempt to control every outcome, every conversation, every uncertainty, because deep down your mind believes certainty equals safety. But life has never promised certainty, and anxiety grows strongest in people who unknowingly wage war against uncertainty every single day. This is why so many intelligent, caring, ambitious people secretly struggle with overthinking. Your brain learned that constant analysis might protect you from pain. So you replay situations trying to avoid mistakes. You predict rejection before it happens. You mentally prepare for disasters that never arrive. And eventually the brain becomes addicted to vigilance. It starts believing that if you stop worrying, something bad will happen. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. Peace feels temporary. Rest feels unsafe. But this is the moment where something important begins to shift. Because once you recognize the cycle, you stop blaming yourself for being trapped inside it. You begin understanding that anxiety is not weakness, it is conditioning. Your brain has practiced fear repeatedly, and repeated thoughts always become stronger pathways. The anxious mind survives through repetition. Every catastrophic thought strengthens emotional memory. Every moment spent obsessing over uncertainty teaches the brain to return there again tomorrow. And yet, this also means something hopeful. If repetition created anxiety, repetition can also create healing. That is the foundation of brain rewiring. Not magically eliminating fear forever, but gradually teaching your nervous system a different response to life. Your anxious brain learned chaos. It can also learn calm. It learned emotional urgency. It can also learn emotional regulation. This is where mental freedom quietly begins, not by controlling the world outside you, but by changing the relationship you have with the world inside you. At first, this shift feels small, almost invisible. You begin noticing thoughts instead of immediately believing them. You pause before reacting emotionally. You recognize that not every feeling is a fact. This awareness creates distance, and distance weakens the anxiety loop. The moment you stop treating every thought like an emergency, your nervous system starts receiving a completely different message. You are safe enough to slow down. And slowing down changes everything. Because anxiety thrives on speed. Fast thinking, fast reactions, fast catastrophizing. The anxious brain jumps from one imagined disaster to another without giving reality time to breathe. Mindfulness interrupts that momentum, not by forcing silence, but by teaching you how to observe without instantly spiraling. You begin sitting with thoughts instead of fighting them. You stop feeding intrusive thoughts with panic. You allow uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to solve it. This is not weakness. This is emotional mastery. And strangely enough, the more you stop resisting every uncomfortable thought, the less power those thoughts begin to have over you. The brain slowly realizes that fear is not always danger. Your body starts calming itself faster. The present moment becomes clearer. You notice your breathing again. You notice your surroundings again. You notice that life was still happening while your mind was trapped somewhere far away. That awareness creates the beginning of inner peace. Not perfect peace, not permanent peace, but real moments of calm thinking inside situations that once controlled you completely. And those moments matter more than you think because every calm response becomes evidence for your nervous system. Every moment you survive uncertainty without spiraling rewires emotional expectation. Every time you interrupt catastrophic thinking, you weaken the old pathway and strengthen a new one. This is why healing rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. It feels repetitive. You choose awareness again and again. You return to the present moment again and again. You challenge negative thoughts again and again. You practice thought control again and again. And slowly the anxious brain begins losing its automatic dominance over your life. The cycle weakens not through force, but through consistency. Still, anxiety has one final trick that keeps many people trapped. It convinces you that healing should happen instantly. So when anxious thoughts return, you think you failed. When stress comes back, you assume nothing changed. But healing is not the absence of anxiety. Healing is changing your response to anxiety. The old version of you immediately believed every fearful thought. The new version pauses, observes, breathes, and responds consciously instead of automatically. That difference may seem small, but over time it transforms your entire emotional reality. Because eventually, the brain starts understanding something it had forgotten for a very long time. You do not need to predict everything to survive it. You do not need to control every possibility to feel safe. You do not need to destroy every fearful thought to experience peace. And maybe for the first time, you begin realizing that mental clarity is not created by controlling the future. It is created by reconnecting with the present. The anxious mind lives tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. But peace only exists here, in this breath, in this moment, in this awareness. That realization changes the entire direction of your healing journey because now you are no longer trying to outrun anxiety. You are finally beginning to understand it. And once you understand the cycle deeply enough, you begin noticing something even more important underneath it, something hidden beneath the overthinking, beneath the fear response, beneath the endless mental noise. The thoughts themselves were never the true source of your suffering. It was the meaning your mind attached to them, the stories you repeated, the emotional habits you never realized were shaping your entire reality. And once that becomes visible, another layer of the anxious brain quietly begins revealing itself. The anxiety habit loop does not begin with danger. It begins with familiarity, a repeated thought, a repeated reaction, a repeated emotional pattern so deeply practiced that your brain eventually stops asking whether it is helpful and simply assumes it is necessary for survival. That is how anxiety quietly takes control of a person's life, not through one dramatic moment, but through small invisible loops repeated every day until overthinking feels automatic, stress feels normal, and inner peace feels distant. And the frightening part is that most people never realize they are trapped inside a pattern. They believe they are trapped inside reality itself. You feel one uncomfortable sensation in your body, maybe tension in your chest, maybe restlessness in your stomach, maybe a sudden wave of uncertainty, and instantly your mind begins searching for answers. Why am I feeling this? What if something is wrong? What if this gets worse? What if I lose control? The thought creates fear. The fear creates physical symptoms. The symptoms create more fearful thoughts, and suddenly the loop closes around you. Your brain remembers that cycle. The next time discomfort appears, it repeats the same process even faster. This is how the anxious brain becomes conditioned. It learns that every uncomfortable feeling deserves immediate attention. It learns that uncertainty must be solved instantly. It learns that overthinking creates temporary relief because the brain mistakes mental activity for control. But relief is not the same thing as healing. Most anxiety loops survive because they reward you for participating in them. Worrying makes you feel prepared for a few moments. Checking your phone repeatedly gives temporary reassurance. Replaying conversations creates the illusion of control. Avoiding situations reduces discomfort for a little while. And because those actions reduce anxiety temporarily, the brain labels them as useful habits. But every temporary escape strengthens the loop long term. That is why anxiety can feel exhausting even when nothing dangerous is happening around you. Your mind never stops working. It keeps searching, analyzing, predicting, preparing, scanning every situation for hidden threats. You may look calm from the outside while internally fighting hundreds of silent battles nobody else can see. This is why so many overthinkers feel emotionally drained all the time. The anxious brain consumes enormous energy trying to protect you from pain that often never arrives. And slowly, without noticing it, your world becomes smaller. You stop trusting yourself. You stop trusting silence. You stop trusting uncertainty. You begin needing reassurance before making decisions. You avoid situations that trigger discomfort. You replay old memories, searching for mistakes. Your nervous system becomes addicted to emotional urgency because calmness feels unfamiliar. Even peaceful moments become suspicious because your brain starts asking, what if something goes wrong next? This is the anxiety habit loop at its deepest level. The brain becomes trapped in survival mode even during ordinary life. But the moment you truly understand the loop, something powerful begins to happen. You realize that anxiety is not randomly attacking you. It is following a learned pattern, and patterns can be changed. That realization becomes the beginning of mental freedom because now you stop seeing yourself as broken. You stop treating anxiety like a mysterious enemy hiding inside your personality. Instead, you begin recognizing that your brain simply learns certain emotional habits through repetition, fear conditioning, stress, emotional experiences, and constant reinforcement. This changes the entire direction of healing because now the goal is no longer to fight your mind. The goal becomes rewiring your relationship with it. And rewiring begins with awareness. The next time anxiety appears, instead of instantly reacting, imagine pausing for one moment. Not forcing yourself to feel calm. Not pretending the fear is gone. Just noticing the loop beginning. Noticing the trigger. Noticing the catastrophic thought trying to pull you into emotional urgency. That tiny moment of awareness may seem small, but psychologically it is massive because you are interrupting automatic behavior. The anxious brain survives through unconscious repetition. Awareness breaks unconscious repetition. This is why mindfulness is so powerful for anxiety relief. Not because it magically removes stressful thoughts, but because it teaches you how to stop feeding them automatically. You begin observing thoughts instead of immediately believing them. You notice fear without becoming consumed by it. You stop treating every intrusive thought like a warning sign. And gradually the brain starts learning something new. A thought is not always a threat. That single understanding weakens the anxiety loop more than most people realize. Because before this shift, every anxious thought felt urgent. Your nervous system reacted instantly. Your body prepared for danger instantly. But now a new space begins forming between the thought and your response. In that space, emotional mastery becomes possible. And at first, this process feels uncomfortable. The anxious brain hates uncertainty because uncertainty removes its illusion of control. When you stop performing old anxiety habits, checking repeatedly, seeking reassurance constantly, overanalyzing every outcome, your mind may temporarily become louder. It may convince you that something terrible will happen if you stop worrying. This is the moment many people panic and return to old patterns. But if you stay present long enough, something unexpected happens. Nothing collapses. You survive the uncertainty. And that experience sends a powerful message to your nervous system. The brain slowly realizes it does not need constant overthinking to keep you safe. Calm becomes less frightening. Silence becomes more comfortable. Your emotional system begins loosening its grip on survival mode. This is how subconscious healing truly works. Not through one giant breakthrough, but through repeated moments where you respond differently than before. Every time you sit with discomfort without spiraling, you weaken the old pathway. Every time you allow uncertainty without chasing reassurance, you strengthen emotional resilience. Every time you breathe through fear instead of obeying it, you teach the brain a new emotional expectation. This is brain rewiring in real time. And the beautiful thing about rewiring is that the brain never stops adapting. The same mind that learned anxiety can also learn peace. The same nervous system that became trapped in fear can also rediscover safety. The same person who once felt consumed by overthinking can eventually experience calm thinking, quiet confidence, and deep mental clarity. But there is another hidden layer inside the anxiety habit loop that many people miss completely. Anxiety often becomes emotionally addictive, not because you enjoy suffering, but because the brain becomes attached to stimulation. Stress creates intensity. Overthinking creates mental activity. Constant emotional urgency floods the nervous system with adrenaline and cortisol, so frequently that calmness almost feels empty at first. Some people become so used to chaos that peace feels unnatural. That is why healing sometimes feels strange in the beginning. Your nervous system has spent years operating at high alert. Slowing down can feel uncomfortable because your body interprets stillness as unfamiliar territory. But unfamiliar does not mean unsafe. And this is where the healing journey becomes deeper than simple anxiety relief. You are not just trying to eliminate stress. You are rebuilding your relationship with yourself. You are learning how to exist without constant emotional warfare happening inside your head. You are learning that your value is not measured by productivity, perfection, or endless mental preparation. You are learning that rest is not laziness. Peace is not weakness. Slowing down is not failure. The more you practice this mindset shift, the more your internal world begins changing. Your breathing slows naturally. Your thoughts lose some of their intensity. Your body stops reacting to every fear as if it were life-threatening. You begin reclaiming the present moment instead of mentally living inside imagined futures. And perhaps for the first time in years, you notice small moments of calm energy appearing throughout your day. Moments where your mind is not racing. Moments where silence no longer feels dangerous. Moments where you are simply existing instead of constantly preparing for disaster. That is not luck. That is evidence of rewiring. And as your awareness grows stronger, another truth slowly begins revealing itself beneath the anxiety habit loop, something deeper than overthinking itself, because the anxious brain is not only shaped by repeated fears, it is also shaped by the hidden stories you continuously tell yourself about who you are, what you deserve, and what you believe might happen if you finally let go of fear completely. The voice inside your head is not neutral. It is shaping your emotional reality every single day. Long before anxiety becomes panic, long before stress becomes exhaustion, long before overthinking steals your peace, there is usually a quiet internal soundtrack playing underneath it all, repeating the same fears, the same doubts, the same predictions, until your brain no longer questions them. Something will go wrong. I'm not enough. I'll embarrass myself. I can't handle this. What if everything falls apart? And because these thoughts repeat so often, they stop sounding like thoughts and start sounding like truth. That is how the anxious brain builds its world. Not through facts, but through repetition. The human mind is constantly narrating life, constantly interpreting situations, constantly attaching meaning to experiences, and over time your inner dialogue becomes the emotional atmosphere you live inside. If your internal soundtrack is filled with fear, criticism, pressure, urgency, and self-doubt, your nervous system begins reacting as if danger is always nearby. You carry tension into conversations. You carry fear into opportunities. You carry exhaustion into moments that were supposed to bring joy. Eventually, anxiety no longer feels like something happening to you. It starts feeling like the background music of your existence. And maybe you have lived with that soundtrack for so long that you no longer notice it consciously. You wake up already thinking about problems. You assume worst-case scenarios automatically. You replay awkward moments long after everyone else forgot them. You compare yourself constantly. You criticize yourself for resting. You expect yourself to handle everything perfectly while secretly feeling overwhelmed inside. The anxious brain becomes so practiced at negativity that calm thinking almost feels unnatural. But here is what changes everything. Your thoughts are not permanent truths. They are practiced mental patterns. And what has been practiced can be replaced. This is where real mental rewiring begins, not by pretending negative thoughts do not exist, but by becoming aware of the emotional soundtrack playing underneath your daily life. Because most people try to change anxiety without changing the language they use toward themselves. They want peace while constantly feeding themselves fear. They want confidence while repeating self-criticism internally all day long. They want emotional freedom while mentally rehearsing failure every night before sleep. The brain listens to repetition more than intention. If you repeatedly tell yourself that life is dangerous, your nervous system stays alert. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are incapable, your confidence weakens. If you constantly replay fear-based stories, your emotional system treats them as preparation for reality. This is why changing your soundtrack is not motivational nonsense. It is cognitive conditioning. Your internal dialogue shapes your emotional chemistry. And the anxious brain especially responds to negative repetition because the brain naturally prioritizes survival over happiness. It remembers painful experiences more strongly than peaceful ones. It scans for threats faster than opportunities. This survival mechanism once protected human beings from physical danger, but in modern life, it often traps people inside emotional danger that exists mostly inside thought patterns. That is why one small mistake can ruin your entire day, while one compliment disappears from your mind within minutes. The anxious brain is always listening for evidence that supports fear. And without realizing it, many people spend years strengthening anxiety simply through the way they speak to themselves internally. They become their own harshest critic, their own source of emotional pressure, their own constant warning system. Even moments of rest become contaminated by guilt because the soundtrack never stops. You should be doing more. You're falling behind. You're wasting time. What if you fail? What if people judge you? What if you never figure this out? The mind repeats these thoughts so often that eventually your body begins responding automatically. Your heart races. Your shoulders tighten. Your breathing changes. Your nervous system prepares for danger even while sitting safely in a quiet room. This is how emotional exhaustion develops. Not always from external problems, but from carrying an internal war inside your head all day long. But imagine for a moment what would happen if the soundtrack changed. Not fake positivity, not denial, not forcing yourself to just think happy thoughts. Real emotional honesty, combined with conscious mental redirection. Imagine interrupting fear-based thinking before it fully spirals. Imagine speaking to yourself with calm awareness instead of automatic panic. Imagine replacing catastrophic predictions with grounded perspective. That is where emotional mastery begins. The goal is not to eliminate every negative thought forever. That is impossible. The goal is to stop automatically surrendering to every fearful thought that appears. You begin observing thoughts instead of obeying them. You begin questioning the stories your anxious brain repeats automatically. Is this thought actually true? Is this fear based on reality or prediction? Am I reacting to what is happening or to what I imagine might happen? That simple pause creates mental clarity because anxiety thrives on automatic momentum. The moment you slow down and question the soundtrack, you weaken its emotional power. And slowly, something remarkable starts happening. You notice how often your mind exaggerates danger. You notice how often you assume rejection without evidence. You notice how frequently you speak to yourself in ways you would never speak to someone you love. That awareness can feel emotional at first because many anxious people realize they have spent years mentally attacking themselves while desperately searching for peace. But awareness is not failure. Awareness is the beginning of transformation. Because now you finally have the opportunity to reprogram your mind intentionally instead of unconsciously repeating old emotional conditioning. This is the essence of cognitive reset. You stop feeding fear automatically. You stop reinforcing emotional chaos every time discomfort appears. You begin creating new emotional pathways through repetition of calmer, healthier thinking patterns. And at first, these new thoughts may feel unnatural. The anxious brain is deeply familiar with stress. Peace feels unfamiliar in the beginning. Calmness may even feel suspicious because your nervous system has spent so much time living in survival mode. But unfamiliar does not mean false. It simply means your brain is adapting to a different emotional environment. This is why consistency matters more than intensity in healing. Small repeated mindset shifts slowly reshape emotional identity. You begin replacing, "I can't handle this," with, "I can move through this." You replace, "Everything is falling apart," with, "This moment is uncomfortable, not permanent." You replace, "Something bad is going to happen," with, "Right now, I am safe." These shifts may seem subtle, but emotionally they are powerful because the brain gradually learns that not every situation requires panic. And as your soundtrack changes, your body changes with it. Your breathing slows more naturally. Your nervous system becomes less reactive. Your thoughts stop racing quite as aggressively. You begin experiencing moments of quiet confidence, moments where you trust yourself without needing absolute certainty. This is how mental freedom grows, not through controlling life perfectly, but through transforming the way you mentally respond to life. You begin discovering that peace is not the absence of uncertainty. Peace is the ability to remain emotionally grounded even while uncertainty exists. That realization changes everything for the anxious mind, because anxiety constantly searches for complete control over the future. But the future has always been unpredictable. Trying to control every outcome only deepens exhaustion. Changing your soundtrack teaches the brain a completely different way to exist. Instead of asking, "How do I prevent every possible problem?" you begin asking, "How do I remain present no matter what happens?" That is a completely different emotional reality. And perhaps the most healing part of this journey is realizing that your inner voice can become a place of safety instead of fear. Imagine carrying calm energy inside yourself instead of constant self-judgment. Imagine facing difficult moments without instantly collapsing into catastrophic thinking. Imagine your mind becoming quieter, slower, softer, clearer. That transformation does not happen overnight. But every time you interrupt negative repetition, every time you choose awareness over panic, every time you speak to yourself with patience instead of punishment, you strengthen new emotional pathways inside the brain. The old soundtrack weakens. The nervous system adapts. Your internal world becomes less hostile. And one day, almost unexpectedly, you notice something different. The silence no longer feels uncomfortable. Your mind is not fighting itself as aggressively. The constant emotional pressure has softened. You are breathing deeper without forcing it. You are no longer trapped in every thought that enters your head. That is the beginning of a peaceful mindset. Not perfection, not emotional numbness, just space inside yourself again. And once that space begins opening, another deeper truth starts revealing itself underneath the soundtrack itself. Because anxiety is not only created by thoughts, it is also shaped by the hidden timelines your mind constantly builds about the future, the past, and the fear of what might happen next. Anxiety loves time travel. It drags you backward into memories you cannot change, then throws you forward into futures that do not yet exist, and somewhere between regret and prediction, you slowly lose the ability to fully live in the present moment. That is the hidden timeline of anxiety, the exhausting emotional pattern where your mind constantly jumps between what happened before and what might happen next, while your body remains trapped in a state of tension the entire time. And if you have lived with anxiety long enough, this timeline may already feel painfully familiar. Your mind replays old conversations while you're trying to sleep. It predicts failure before opportunities even begin. It rehearses arguments that never happen. It imagines disasters during peaceful moments. One small memory triggers shame from years ago. One uncertain situation creates fear about tomorrow. And suddenly your emotional energy disappears into places that are not even happening right now. This is why anxious people often feel mentally exhausted even during quiet days. The brain is constantly traveling through emotional timelines instead of resting inside the present. And the strange part is that anxiety convinces you this mental time travel is useful. It tells you that replaying the past will somehow protect you from future mistakes. It tells you that overthinking tomorrow will prepare you for uncertainty. It tells you that worrying equals responsibility. But what actually happens is something very different. Your nervous system never gets a chance to recover because your brain keeps activating emotional stress over situations that are either already gone or not yet real. That is the anxiety timeline at work. The anxious brain rarely stays where life is actually happening. It survives by mentally escaping the present moment. And once you begin noticing this pattern, so many things start making sense. You understand why relaxing feels difficult. You understand why your body stays tense even when nothing dangerous is around you. You understand why peace can feel temporary, because anxiety constantly pulls your attention away from now and into imagined emotional scenarios. The past becomes a source of regret. The future becomes a source of fear. And the present becomes invisible. This is why many people with anxiety feel disconnected from their own lives. They are physically present but mentally elsewhere, sitting with friends while replaying mistakes, walking through a beautiful day while imagining future disasters, trying to rest while internally preparing for problems that have not happened. The anxious mind treats uncertainty like an emergency that must be solved immediately. But uncertainty has always existed. Life was never fully predictable, and the more you try to mentally control every possible outcome, the more exhausted your nervous system becomes. This is where an important mindset shift begins to emerge. Healing anxiety is not about controlling time. It is about changing your relationship with it. Because the truth is, the past only survives emotionally through repetition. Every time you replay painful memories with self-judgment, the nervous system relives them again. Every time you mentally revisit embarrassing moments, failures, heartbreak, or regrets, your body reacts as if the experience is happening now. The brain does not always distinguish clearly between imagination and immediate reality. That is why overthinking feels physically draining. Your thoughts are influencing your nervous system in real time. And the future creates a similar trap. The anxious brain constantly scans ahead looking for danger. It predicts rejection before conversations begin. It imagines failure before trying. It catastrophizes ordinary uncertainty into emotional disaster. The body begins reacting to imagined futures with real physical stress, racing heartbeat, shallow breathing, tight muscles, mental restlessness. Over time, this creates chronic emotional exhaustion because your nervous system spends most of its life preparing for things that may never happen. But there is something deeply freeing hidden inside this realization. If anxiety survives through mental time travel, peace begins by returning to the present, not as a cliché, not as empty motivational advice, as a neurological reset. Because the present moment is the only place where your nervous system can actually rest. Right now, in this exact moment, many of the fears your mind creates are not physically happening. But anxiety keeps convincing you to emotionally live inside possibilities instead of realities. It teaches you to confuse prediction with truth. And slowly, you stop trusting calm because your brain believes constant vigilance equals safety. But calmness is not carelessness. Presence is not weakness. Slowing down does not mean you are losing control. In fact, the opposite is true. The moment you return to the present moment, you interrupt the anxiety timeline itself. You stop feeding emotional energy into imagined futures. You stop reliving old pain repeatedly. You begin grounding yourself in what is actually real right now. And at first, this feels uncomfortable. The anxious brain is addicted to movement. It wants answers immediately. It wants certainty immediately. It wants resolution immediately. Sitting quietly in the present can initially feel strange because your nervous system has spent so long preparing for danger that stillness almost feels unsafe. But this is where emotional mastery begins. Not in eliminating uncertainty forever, but in learning how to remain grounded even while uncertainty exists. You begin noticing your breathing instead of immediately following fearful thoughts. You notice your surroundings instead of replaying worst-case scenarios. You allow uncomfortable emotions to exist without instantly trying to solve them. Slowly, the nervous system starts receiving a new message. You are safe enough to stop running mentally. That message changes the brain more than most people realize, because every moment spent present weakens anxiety's control over time. Every moment you choose awareness instead of spiraling strengthens emotional resilience. Every moment you interrupt catastrophic thinking creates new neural pathways inside the brain. This is mental rewiring happening quietly beneath the surface. And over time, your relationship with the past also begins changing. You stop using old mistakes as proof that you are broken. You stop defining yourself by moments you wish had gone differently. You begin understanding that your younger self was often reacting from fear, confusion, emotional survival, or pain. Instead of constantly attacking yourself for previous decisions, you begin offering yourself understanding. That shift creates deep emotional healing because anxiety often survives through self-punishment. The mind keeps replaying old memories, searching for certainty, closure, or control over what cannot be changed. But healing begins the moment you stop emotionally fighting timelines that no longer exist. The past can teach you, but it does not have to imprison you. And the future also begins losing some of its emotional power. You realize how many fears never actually happened. How many sleepless nights were spent preparing for situations that resolved themselves differently. How much life was missed because the anxious brain was too busy predicting danger to experience the moment itself. That realization can feel both painful and liberating. Painful because you recognize how much energy anxiety consumed. Liberating because now you finally see another possibility. A different way to live. A slower nervous system. A quieter mind. A peaceful mindset that does not require controlling every outcome before allowing yourself to breathe. This is where self-mastery starts becoming real. Not through perfection, but through awareness. You begin catching yourself when the mind travels too far into fear-based timelines. You gently return to the present instead of chasing every anxious prediction. You stop demanding certainty from life before allowing yourself peace. And something beautiful starts happening as a result. Your body softens. Your breathing deepens. Your thoughts slow down. The emotional urgency begins fading. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because your relationship with uncertainty changes completely. You realize you do not need to mentally live tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. You do not need to constantly replay yesterday to deserve growth. You do not need to solve every possible future to experience calm energy today. The anxious timeline weakens every time you return to now. And perhaps for the first time in years, you begin noticing moments where your mind is simply here, not trapped in fear, not racing ahead, not dragging old pain behind it, just existing quietly inside the present moment without needing to escape it. That silence feels unfamiliar at first, then peaceful, then healing. And once the mind begins slowing down enough to see the present clearly again, another deeper realization quietly begins surfacing underneath the anxiety itself, because the way you interpret events, thoughts, and emotions often shapes your suffering far more than the events themselves ever could. Your mind can create an emotional storm in seconds, not because reality changed instantly, but because your interpretation of reality changed instantly. One message gets ignored, and suddenly your brain whispers rejection. One mistake happens, and suddenly your mind predicts failure. One uncomfortable sensation appears in your body, and anxiety immediately starts building a disaster around it. That is how the anxious brain operates. It does not simply react to events. It reacts to the meaning attached to those events. And once you finally understand this, you begin discovering one of the most powerful tools for emotional mastery, a method that slowly teaches you how to interrupt automatic fear before it completely takes over your inner world. Because most people never pause long enough to examine what is actually happening inside their minds. They feel anxiety, and instantly believe the story attached to it. They assume every thought deserves trust. They assume every fear deserves attention. But the anxious brain is often unreliable when fear becomes its primary lens. It exaggerates danger, predicts catastrophe, personalizes uncertainty, and transforms possibilities into emotional certainty. That is why the ABCD method feels so transformative. It gives structure to the chaos. It slows the emotional spiral down long enough for awareness to return. Instead of becoming consumed by anxiety automatically, you begin learning how to observe your thoughts, question them, challenge them, and ultimately reshape your emotional response before the loop strengthens itself again. And this shift begins with something surprisingly simple: an activating event. That is where anxiety almost always starts. Something happens outside you. Maybe someone speaks in a certain tone. Maybe you receive criticism. Maybe plans change unexpectedly. Maybe you notice physical tension in your chest. Maybe you remember something painful from your past. The activating event itself may be small, ordinary, or even neutral, but the anxious brain reacts quickly because it has been trained to search for emotional danger everywhere. And yet, the event itself is rarely what destroys your peace. What happens next matters far more. Because immediately after the activating event comes the belief. This is the hidden layer most people never notice. The brain instantly creates meaning around what happened. They must be angry at me. I'm going to fail. Something bad is happening. I can't handle this. Everything is falling apart. The mind moves so quickly that these thoughts feel automatic, almost invisible. But these beliefs shape your emotional reality more than the event itself ever could. Two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different emotions because their beliefs are different. One person sees uncertainty and thinks possibility. Another sees uncertainty and thinks disaster. One person experiences discomfort and thinks growth. Another experiences discomfort and thinks danger. The anxious brain often chooses the interpretation most connected to fear because fear feels familiar. It feels protective, but familiarity is not always truth. And once those beliefs appear, consequences follow immediately. Your emotions shift. Your body reacts. Your nervous system activates. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your thoughts race faster. Your muscles tighten. You feel panic, sadness, shame, anger, helplessness, emotional exhaustion. The body responds to the belief as though it were reality itself. This is why anxiety feels so physically real. Because your nervous system does not wait for proof before reacting. It reacts to interpretation. And for many people, this process happens dozens of times every day without conscious awareness. One fearful interpretation after another creates emotional overload. Over time, the brain becomes trapped inside a cycle where stressful thoughts automatically produce stressful feelings, and stressful feelings reinforce stressful thoughts again. But this is where the true power of emotional awareness begins. Because once you recognize the pattern, you no longer have to remain unconscious inside it. This is where disputing enters the picture, and this single step can completely change the relationship you have with anxiety. Instead of immediately accepting every fearful belief, you begin questioning it. Is this thought completely true? What evidence actually supports it? Am I predicting the future right now? Am I catastrophizing a temporary situation? Would I speak this way to someone I love? Could there be another interpretation besides fear? At first, this may feel unnatural because anxious thinking thrives on certainty. The anxious brain wants immediate answers, immediate control, immediate emotional conclusions. Slowing down to question the thought interrupts the emotional momentum anxiety depends on. And that interruption creates space. Space between thought and reaction. Space between fear and reality. Space where calm thinking becomes possible again. You begin realizing that many thoughts are not facts. They are emotional predictions created by old conditioning, fear response, stress habits, past pain, insecurity, or overthinking patterns your brain has repeated for years. The more you practice disputing anxious beliefs, the weaker those automatic pathways become. This is mental rewiring happening in real time, not by forcing positivity, but by creating balance. And something remarkable begins happening as you continue practicing this process. Your emotional response changes. This is the final emotional effect of the method. When your interpretation changes, your nervous system changes with it. The body softens. The emotional urgency decreases. Your mind stops spiraling as intensely. You begin responding to life instead of automatically reacting to fear. This is where psychological freedom quietly begins emerging. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because your thoughts no longer control you with the same intensity. Imagine how different your emotional world becomes once you stop believing every catastrophic prediction automatically. Imagine how much mental clarity returns when you no longer treat every uncomfortable feeling like evidence of danger. Imagine the relief of realizing that your anxious thoughts are often interpretations, not prophecies. That realization alone can feel like an anxiety reset, because suddenly, you are no longer powerless inside your own mind. You begin understanding that the anxious brain often creates emotional suffering long before reality itself does. It fills silence with assumptions. It fills uncertainty with fear. It fills ordinary moments with imagined disasters. But now you have awareness, and awareness changes everything. You start catching the spiral earlier. You start recognizing the language of anxiety before it fully consumes you. You notice how often the mind jumps to extremes. You notice how frequently fear speaks in absolutes. Always. Never. Everyone. Everything. The anxious brain loves dramatic certainty because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But reality is rarely that extreme. Most situations are more flexible than anxiety allows you to see. And the more you practice questioning fearful thoughts, the more emotional resilience develops naturally. You become less reactive, more grounded, more present. Your nervous system slowly learns that not every uncomfortable thought deserves panic. That shift creates deep inner peace because your mind finally begins feeling safer to live inside. And perhaps one of the most healing parts of this process is the self-compassion it creates. Many anxious people spend years attacking themselves for their thoughts, criticizing themselves for feeling overwhelmed, ashamed of their panic, embarrassed by their overthinking. But once you understand how the anxious brain actually works, you stop treating yourself like the enemy. You realize your mind was trying to protect you, even if imperfectly. You realize your fear response developed through repetition, conditioning, emotional experiences, and survival instincts. And instead of punishing yourself for anxiety, you begin guiding yourself through it with awareness. That changes the healing journey completely. Because true emotional mastery is not built through self-hatred. It is built through conscious understanding, patience, mindfulness, and repeated practice. Every time you pause before believing an anxious thought, you strengthen new pathways. Every time you challenge catastrophic thinking, you weaken fear conditioning. Every time you return to the present moment instead of spiraling into imagined futures, you reclaim mental freedom piece by piece. This process is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming conscious. You still feel emotions. You still experience uncertainty. You still have difficult moments. But now you are no longer drowning inside automatic interpretations created by anxiety. You begin separating what is real from what is feared. And that distinction changes the entire atmosphere inside your mind. The emotional chaos softens. The nervous system slows down. The mental noise becomes quieter. And in those quieter moments, you begin discovering something anxiety tried to hide from you for a very long time. Something simple, yet deeply powerful. You are far more capable of handling life than your fearful thoughts ever allowed you to believe. And once that quiet confidence starts growing inside you, another hidden pattern begins revealing itself beneath the surface. Because anxiety is not only fueled by fearful interpretations, it is also strengthened by the impossible expectations your mind quietly places upon yourself every single day. The anxious mind carries invisible pressure everywhere it goes. Pressure to succeed. Pressure to never fail. Pressure to always know the right answer, make the right decision, say the right thing, control the right outcome. And after living with these expectations long enough, you stop realizing how heavy they actually are because the weight becomes familiar. You wake up already mentally preparing yourself for everything that could go wrong. You expect yourself to handle stress perfectly, emotions perfectly, relationships perfectly, productivity perfectly, and somewhere deep inside, anxiety quietly grows stronger every time reality refuses to match the impossible standards your mind created. This is one of the hidden engines behind overthinking. Not just fear itself, but the expectation that you must always avoid fear completely. The expectation that uncertainty should not exist. The expectation that discomfort means something is wrong. And because life can never fully satisfy these expectations, the anxious brain remains trapped in constant emotional tension, always searching for control, always trying to predict outcomes before they happen, always preparing for situations that may never arrive. You may not even notice how often your mind speaks in impossible demands. I should have everything figured out by now. I should never feel anxious. I should always be productive. I should not disappoint anyone. I should handle this better. The word should becomes a quiet form of emotional pressure repeated throughout the day until your nervous system begins treating ordinary life like an endless performance review. Every mistake feels personal. Every delay feels dangerous. Every setback feels like proof that you are failing. And the cruelest part is that many anxious people are deeply hard on themselves while simultaneously trying their best to survive emotionally. They carry silent exhaustion nobody else sees. They push themselves constantly while secretly feeling overwhelmed. They judge themselves for struggling while pretending everything is fine. This creates an internal atmosphere where peace becomes almost impossible because your mind is never allowed to simply exist without pressure attached to it. But something changes the moment you begin questioning those expectations instead of automatically obeying them. Because anxiety often grows strongest in the gap between reality and unrealistic emotional demands. The wider the gap becomes, the more disappointment, shame, frustration, and fear your nervous system experiences. And slowly, the anxious brain starts believing that unless everything happens exactly as expected, safety and happiness are impossible. But life was never designed to follow perfect expectations. People misunderstand you sometimes. Plans change unexpectedly. Mistakes happen. Emotions fluctuate. Uncertainty appears without warning. And none of those things mean you are failing as a human being. This realization becomes the beginning of emotional freedom because now you stop fighting reality every moment it refuses to match the fantasy created inside your mind. Instead of demanding perfection from yourself and life, you begin creating flexibility. And flexibility changes the emotional experience of anxiety completely. Imagine how different your nervous system feels when you stop expecting yourself to never feel stress again. Imagine how much calmer your mind becomes when you stop treating every difficult emotion like evidence that something is wrong with you. Imagine the relief of understanding that healing does not require perfection. It requires patience. The anxious brain often creates impossible timelines for healing. It says, I should already be better. I should not still struggle with this. Why am I not healed yet? But emotional rewiring does not happen instantly. The mind changes through repetition, awareness, mindfulness, and gradual nervous system adaptation. And every time you judge yourself for not healing fast enough, you unintentionally create more emotional resistance inside the process itself. That resistance creates exhaustion, because now you are not only dealing with anxiety, you are also criticizing yourself for experiencing anxiety. This is why self-compassion becomes such an important part of mental rewiring. Not soft weakness, not avoiding growth, real understanding, real patience with the nervous system, real acceptance that your brain learned these patterns over years of repetition and survival conditioning. You are not weak for needing time to heal. You are human. And strangely enough, the moment you stop demanding instant perfection from yourself, the nervous system often begins calming down faster. The emotional pressure softens. Your body stops feeling like it is constantly failing some invisible test. You begin breathing more naturally again because your mind is no longer fighting itself every second. This creates a powerful mindset shift. Instead of asking, "How do I eliminate every uncomfortable feeling?" you begin asking, "How do I respond to discomfort with awareness instead of panic?" That single shift changes everything. Because now anxiety is no longer treated like an enemy that must disappear before you can live peacefully. Instead, it becomes something you can understand, navigate, and move through without losing yourself inside it. And managing expectations also changes the way you relate to other people. Many anxious minds secretly expect rejection before connection even begins. They expect disappointment before vulnerability. They expect criticism before expression. The brain constantly predicts emotional pain because it believes prediction equals protection. But prediction often becomes self-imprisonment. You hold yourself back emotionally because your mind is already living inside imagined outcomes. You avoid opportunities because you expect failure. You stay silent because you expect judgment. You overprepare because you expect mistakes. Eventually, anxiety convinces you that safety only exists inside control. Yet some of the most meaningful moments in life happen when control loosens. Real connection, real growth, real healing. None of these emerge from perfect certainty. They emerge from willingness. Willingness to exist imperfectly. Willingness to make mistakes. Willingness to experience uncertainty without immediately collapsing into fear. This is where quiet confidence slowly begins growing. Not because you suddenly know exactly what will happen, but because you begin trusting your ability to handle life without needing constant emotional prediction beforehand. And that trust rewires the anxious brain in profound ways. Your nervous system slowly learns that uncertainty is survivable, that discomfort is temporary, that mistakes are not identity, that emotions rise and fall naturally, that your value does not disappear every time life becomes messy. These realizations soften the emotional rigidity anxiety depends on. The mind becomes more flexible. The body becomes less reactive. You stop trying to force reality into impossible expectations and begin allowing yourself to move with life instead of constantly fighting against it. And perhaps the most healing part of managing expectations is what happens internally when you finally stop demanding perfection from your own mind. You stop expecting yourself to always be calm. You stop expecting yourself to always feel motivated. You stop expecting every day to feel emotionally easy. You stop expecting healing to move in a straight line. And in that acceptance, something beautiful begins happening. The fear around anxiety itself weakens. Because many anxious people are not only afraid of life, they become afraid of their own emotions. Afraid of panic. Afraid of uncertainty. Afraid of losing control. But when you stop treating every emotional fluctuation like catastrophe, your relationship with anxiety changes completely. You begin understanding that emotions are experiences, not permanent identities. A stressful moment does not define your future. An anxious thought does not define reality. A difficult day does not erase your growth. This creates emotional resilience naturally, because resilience is not built through controlling life perfectly. It is built through learning that you can remain grounded even when life becomes imperfect. And the more grounded you become, the quieter the mind starts feeling. Not perfectly silent, but softer, less urgent, less aggressive. The mental noise loses some of its authority over you. You stop chasing impossible certainty all day long. You stop demanding answers for every unknown. You stop carrying the unbearable pressure of trying to control everything before allowing yourself peace. And suddenly the present moment becomes easier to experience. Your breathing deepens. Your shoulders relax. Your thoughts slow down enough for awareness to return. You begin realizing how much suffering came not only from anxiety itself, but from the impossible expectations wrapped around it. That realization creates profound inner peace because now you are no longer fighting yourself constantly. You are learning how to exist with patience, flexibility, mindfulness, and emotional honesty. And once the pressure of impossible expectations begins dissolving, another deeper pattern quietly starts becoming visible underneath the surface, because anxiety does not only distort your expectations about life, it also distorts the way you interpret yourself, your thoughts, and the stories your mind automatically believes every single day. Your mind can lie to you with complete confidence. That is one of the most dangerous things about anxiety. The thoughts feel real, immediate, convincing, emotional, urgent, and because they arrive automatically, you rarely stop to question them. You simply believe them. One mistake becomes proof that you are failing. One awkward moment becomes proof that everyone is judging you. One uncertain situation becomes evidence that disaster is coming. And after years of thinking this way, the anxious brain begins treating distorted thoughts like unquestionable reality. This is where emotional suffering quietly multiplies, not always because of what is happening around you, but because of the distorted way anxiety interprets what is happening around you. These distortions are not random. They are mental habits, automatic patterns the brain repeats so often that they become invisible. The anxious mind magnifies danger, minimizes hope, predicts worst-case outcomes, and filters reality through fear. It is like wearing emotional glasses that quietly change everything you see. And once those distortions become deeply practiced, even ordinary situations can begin triggering emotional chaos. You send a message and someone replies late, and instantly your mind says, "They are upset with me." You make one small error at work or school, and your brain whispers, "I always mess things up." You feel nervous during a conversation, and suddenly anxiety says, "Everyone can see how awkward I am." These thoughts appear so quickly that they feel like truth instead of interpretation. But thoughts are not always facts. And that realization becomes one of the most powerful turning points in healing the anxious brain. Because cognitive distortions survive through automatic belief. The moment you begin slowing down enough to observe them consciously, their emotional power starts weakening. Suddenly the mind is no longer an unquestioned narrator. It becomes something you can examine, challenge, and gradually retrain. This is why awareness creates mental freedom. The anxious brain thrives in unconscious thinking patterns. It wants you reacting automatically, emotionally, impulsively. But once you begin recognizing distortions, you stop drowning inside every thought that appears. You begin noticing the patterns underneath the anxiety itself. All or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, mind reading, fortune telling, overgeneralizing, emotional reasoning. The anxious mind constantly jumps to extremes because fear craves certainty. It would rather assume the worst immediately than tolerate uncertainty patiently. But this creates exhausting emotional pressure because your nervous system begins responding to imagined danger all day long. And perhaps you know this feeling deeply. Your body feels tense before anything has even happened. Your mind rehearses negative outcomes before opportunities begin. You assume rejection before connection, failure before effort, embarrassment before expression. The anxious brain becomes addicted to prediction because prediction creates the illusion of control. But prediction is not protection. Most anxious thoughts are not preparing you for reality. They are preparing you for fear. And this is exactly where the triple column technique becomes so transformative, because it interrupts the emotional momentum of distorted thinking, and forces the mind to slow down long enough for clarity to return. Imagine placing your thoughts in front of you instead of carrying them invisibly inside your head all day. In the first space, you write the painful thought exactly as it appears. I'm going to fail. Nobody understands me. I always ruin everything. Something bad is going to happen. Then, in the next space, you identify the distortion hiding inside the thought. Maybe it is catastrophizing. Maybe black and white thinking. Maybe emotional reasoning. Maybe fortune-telling. Suddenly, the thought loses some of its authority because now you are not simply believing it. You are analyzing it. This changes the relationship between you and your anxiety completely. Because awareness creates distance, and distance weakens emotional intensity. Then comes the most healing part of the process. In the final space, you replace the distorted thought with a more balanced and truthful perspective. Not fake positivity, not forced optimism. Reality, balanced thinking, compassionate truth. Instead of, I'm going to fail, the new thought becomes, I'm nervous, but nervousness does not predict failure. Instead of, nobody likes me, the thought becomes, my anxiety is making assumptions without evidence. Instead of, everything is ruined, the thought becomes, this situation is uncomfortable but temporary. That shift may sound simple, but psychologically it is profound because your nervous system reacts differently when the interpretation changes. The body softens. The emotional urgency decreases. Your brain stops spiraling quite so aggressively because the catastrophic fuel feeding the anxiety has been interrupted. This is cognitive reset happening in real time. And at first, your anxious brain may resist this process completely. Old thought patterns are deeply familiar. Fear-based thinking has been practiced for years. The mind may immediately argue against healthier interpretations because anxiety feels safer when it stays in control. But healing is not about instantly silencing fear. Healing is about repeatedly returning to awareness until new pathways become stronger than the old ones. Every time you challenge a distortion, you weaken its emotional grip. Every time you replace catastrophic thinking with grounded perspective, you strengthen calm thinking. Every time you pause before believing an intrusive thought, you teach your nervous system that thoughts alone are not emergencies. This is how brain rewiring actually happens. Quietly, gradually, through repetition. And something beautiful begins happening as you continue practicing this awareness. You start noticing how often anxiety exaggerates reality. You catch yourself spiraling earlier. You recognize emotional patterns before they fully consume your day. The mental noise becomes easier to observe without instantly obeying it. That creates emotional resilience. Not because negative thoughts disappear forever, but because they stop controlling you with the same intensity. You begin understanding that the anxious brain often confuses feelings with facts. If you feel insecure, anxiety says you must be inadequate. If you feel uncertain, anxiety says danger must be near. If you feel discomfort, anxiety says something is wrong. But emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent truths. And this distinction changes everything. Because now you stop fearing your own thoughts so much. You stop treating every intrusive idea like prophecy. You stop assuming every uncomfortable emotion defines reality. Instead, you become curious about your mind instead of trapped inside it. That curiosity creates deep self-awareness, and self-awareness creates freedom. You begin realizing that many of your harshest thoughts were never objective truths. They were conditioned fear responses shaped through repetition, stress, insecurity, past experiences, and emotional survival patterns. The anxious brain learned these distortions over time, which means it can also unlearn them over time. This realization creates hope. Real hope, not temporary motivation, but genuine psychological freedom. Because suddenly anxiety is no longer some mysterious force controlling your life from the shadows. You can see its patterns now. You can recognize its language. You can identify its distortions before they completely hijack your nervous system. And the more clearly you see anxiety, the less power it quietly holds over your inner world. Your mind becomes calmer, your breathing steadier, your emotional reactions less extreme. The constant pressure inside your chest softens little by little. You stop living entirely inside catastrophic predictions and begin reconnecting with the present moment again. That is where inner peace slowly begins returning. Not because life becomes perfect, but because your interpretation of life becomes healthier, more balanced, more compassionate, and more grounded in reality instead of fear. And as your awareness deepens, another important truth quietly starts emerging beneath the distortions themselves. Because many anxious thoughts do not begin with reality at all. They begin with the hidden emotional stories your subconscious mind has been repeating about who you are, what you deserve, and what you believe you must become in order to finally feel safe. Anxiety can make imagination feel more real than reality itself. That is the trap. Your mind creates a fearful story. Your body reacts to the story as though it is already happening. And suddenly you are emotionally drowning inside events that may never exist outside your thoughts. The anxious brain does this constantly. It predicts rejection before people even speak. It predicts failure before effort begins. It predicts disaster before life has had a chance to unfold naturally. And after repeating these fearful predictions long enough, you stop realizing how much of your suffering is being created not by reality, but by interpretation. This is why reality testing becomes so powerful. Because anxiety survives in assumptions. It grows in imagined scenarios. It strengthens itself through predictions, emotional reasoning, and catastrophic thinking patterns that quietly distort the way you see yourself, other people, and the future. The anxious mind rarely asks, "What is actually happening right now?" Instead, it asks, "What if the worst happens?" And once that question takes over, your nervous system begins reacting immediately. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts race. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your body prepares for emotional danger even when no actual threat exists in the present moment. You may know this feeling deeply. You send a text and instantly begin assuming someone is upset because they have not replied yet. You walk into a room and suddenly feel convinced everyone is judging you. You make one small mistake and your mind immediately jumps toward failure, embarrassment, rejection, or disaster. The anxious brain turns possibilities into emotional certainties. But possibilities are not proof. Thoughts are not facts. Feelings are not always reality. And this is exactly where reality testing begins changing the emotional experience of anxiety. Because reality testing teaches you how to pause before automatically believing the fearful story your mind creates. It teaches you to separate what is happening from what anxiety is predicting. That separation creates mental clarity, and mental clarity weakens emotional panic. Imagine how different your inner world becomes when you stop instantly surrendering to every anxious assumption. Imagine catching the spiral early enough to ask yourself one simple question. What evidence do I actually have right now? That question sounds small, but psychologically it is transformative because anxious thinking thrives on emotional momentum. The brain wants you reacting quickly, emotionally, automatically. Reality testing interrupts that momentum and forces awareness back into the process. Suddenly, you begin noticing something important. Many anxious thoughts are built on incomplete information. Your friend may simply be busy, not angry. Your nervousness during a conversation does not mean you embarrassed yourself. A difficult moment does not automatically predict a terrible future. The anxious brain often fills uncertainty with fear because fear feels familiar. It would rather create a painful answer immediately than tolerate the discomfort of not knowing. But immediate assumptions often create unnecessary emotional suffering. And once you begin testing reality instead of obeying fear automatically, your nervous system starts learning a completely new emotional pattern. You stop reacting to imagination as though it were fact. That shift creates enormous emotional relief because so much anxiety comes from mentally living inside situations that are not truly happening. Your mind predicts conversations before they occur. It imagines rejection before vulnerability. It rehearses disasters before ordinary events. The body experiences stress repeatedly because the brain cannot fully distinguish between imagined emotional danger and immediate reality. This is why overthinking feels physically exhausting. Your nervous system is constantly preparing for survival. Reality testing changes this by grounding you back inside the present moment. Instead of asking, "What terrible thing could happen?" you begin asking, "What is actually true right now?" That question slows the emotional storm down. And slowing down matters because anxiety moves fast. Fear jumps ahead instantly. But calm thinking requires awareness. It requires space between thought and reaction. At first, reality testing may feel uncomfortable because the anxious brain is deeply attached to certainty, even painful certainty. Fearful assumptions can strangely feel safer than uncertainty because at least the mind believes it is preparing you emotionally. But preparation through constant panic is not protection. It is emotional exhaustion disguised as control. And many people spend years trapped inside this cycle without realizing it. They overanalyze every interaction. They replay conversations repeatedly. They search constantly for hidden signs of danger. They assume worst-case outcomes automatically. Eventually, the nervous system becomes addicted to vigilance. Peace begins feeling unfamiliar because the brain believes safety only exists when it is scanning for problems. But true emotional mastery begins when you realize you do not need to believe every fear in order to survive life. You can pause. You can question the thought. You can examine the evidence. You can allow uncertainty to exist without instantly turning it into catastrophe. This is where brain rewiring quietly begins happening. Every time you test reality instead of surrendering to fear, you weaken the anxious pathway slightly. Every time you challenge catastrophic assumptions, you strengthen emotional resilience. Every time you return to facts instead of predictions, your nervous system learns that not every thought deserves panic. And slowly, your inner world begins changing. The mental noise softens. Your body reacts less intensely. Your thoughts lose some of their urgency. You stop emotionally collapsing every time uncertainty appears. That creates quiet confidence because now your stability is no longer entirely dependent on controlling the future. You begin trusting your ability to handle life without needing constant prediction and mental rehearsal beforehand. And perhaps one of the most healing parts of reality testing is the compassion it creates toward yourself. Because once you start seeing how anxiety distorts perception, you stop blaming yourself quite so harshly for struggling. You realize your brain was trying to protect you, even if imperfectly. It learned to expect danger through repetition, stress, emotional pain, past experiences, and fear conditioning. The anxious brain was trained to survive. But survival mode is not the same thing as living peacefully. Reality testing helps the mind reconnect with what is actually happening instead of endlessly fighting imagined timelines. It brings your awareness back to the present moment, where your nervous system can finally begin calming down again. And in those moments of calm awareness, something powerful starts happening. You realize how many fears never became reality. How many sleepless nights were spent preparing for situations that never happened. How many emotional storms were created by assumptions instead of facts. That realization can feel emotional because you begin understanding how much energy anxiety consumed over the years. But it also creates hope because now you finally see another possibility. A quieter mind, a calmer nervous system, a more balanced relationship with your thoughts. You stop treating every intrusive idea like prophecy. You stop assuming discomfort equals danger. You stop viewing uncertainty as proof that something terrible is coming. Instead, you begin grounding yourself in reality again. In this breath, in this moment, and what is actually true right now. That presence creates deep psychological freedom because anxiety loses strength when it can no longer drag you endlessly into imagined disasters. The present moment becomes less frightening. Silence becomes more comfortable. Your mind stops fighting itself with the same intensity. And once you begin reconnecting with reality clearly again, another deeper layer of healing quietly starts unfolding beneath the surface. Because even after distorted thoughts weaken, many anxious patterns still remain connected to the physical habits your body learned through years of living in emotional survival mode. What if the strongest version of you is already inside your mind, buried underneath fear, overthinking, self-doubt, and years of anxious conditioning? What if anxiety becomes weaker the moment you stop seeing yourself only through panic and start stepping into a calmer identity instead? Because the anxious brain is constantly asking one exhausting question every single day. What if I can't handle this? And after hearing that question long enough, your nervous system begins believing you are fragile, incapable, emotionally powerless, always one stressful moment away from breaking apart. But that is not the full truth about you. The mind is deeply influenced by identity. The way you see yourself changes the way you think, the way you feel, the way you react, and even the way your nervous system responds under pressure. When you constantly identify yourself as anxious, weak, broken, socially awkward, emotionally unstable, or incapable, your brain begins operating through those labels automatically. Every situation becomes filtered through fear because your subconscious mind is trying to remain consistent with the identity you repeat internally. This is where something fascinating begins happening. The moment you psychologically step outside your anxious identity, even briefly, your emotional response starts changing. This is what many people call the Batman effect. Not because you become a superhero overnight, but because you learn how to mentally create distance between your fearful emotions and your deeper self-awareness. Instead of asking, "Why am I so anxious?" you begin asking, "How would the strongest version of me respond right now?" That subtle shift changes the emotional atmosphere inside your mind in powerful ways. Because anxiety thrives when you become completely fused with fear. The moment fear feels like your entire identity, panic gains enormous control over your nervous system. But when you create psychological distance, even small distance, you regain perspective. You stop drowning inside emotions and begin observing them more calmly. Imagine a child trying something difficult. Researchers discovered that children often perform better under stress when they pretend to become a courageous character instead of focusing only on themselves. Instead of saying, "I'm scared," they mentally step into another role and ask, "What would Batman do right now?" Suddenly fear becomes smaller because attention shifts away from emotional helplessness toward empowered action. And the same principle quietly works inside the anxious adult mind too. Because your brain responds differently depending on the identity you activate internally. When anxiety takes over, your internal language becomes weak, fearful, emotionally overwhelmed. "I can't do this. I'm going to embarrass myself. I always fail." But the moment you mentally step outside that anxious version of yourself, something changes. You begin responding from awareness instead of panic. What would the calm version of me do? What would the grounded version of me focus on? How would someone with emotional resilience move through this moment? This is not fake confidence. This is psychological reframing. And reframing changes everything because your nervous system listens carefully to the identity you repeat inside your mind. If you constantly identify as powerless, your body reacts with fear more easily. If you begin identifying as adaptable, resilient, capable of handling discomfort, your emotional response slowly shifts too. This is brain rewiring happening through identity. And perhaps you already know what it feels like to become trapped inside anxious self-perception. Maybe anxiety has convinced you that you are socially incapable, Maybe overthinking has convinced you that your mind is permanently broken. Maybe panic attacks made you believe you cannot trust yourself anymore. The anxious brain loves attaching fear to identity because identity feels permanent. But emotions are temporary. Thoughts are temporary. Even anxiety patterns are temporary when awareness enters the process consistently. The Batman effect teaches you that you are larger than the emotional state you are experiencing in this moment. You are not just the panic, not just the overthinking, not just the intrusive thoughts. There is a deeper observing awareness underneath the emotional storm, and reconnecting with that awareness creates psychological freedom. This is why emotionally resilient people are not fearless all the time. They simply refuse to let fear become their entire identity. They feel anxiety, but they do not become anxiety. They experience stress, but they do not surrender their self-perception completely to stress. That distinction matters deeply, because when you fully identify with anxious thoughts, every fear feels personal, permanent, and absolute. But when you create distance, you begin seeing thoughts as experiences passing through the mind, instead of defining who you are completely. This creates calm thinking. And calm thinking changes your nervous system. Imagine yourself walking into a stressful situation while mentally repeating, "I always panic." Your body immediately prepares for fear. Your breathing changes. Your attention narrows. Your brain begins scanning for danger before anything even happens. Now imagine entering the same situation while asking, "How would my strongest self respond calmly right now?" The situation may still feel uncomfortable, but your emotional energy shifts completely. Your focus moves toward grounded action instead of helpless anticipation. That shift weakens the anxiety loop. Because anxious habits survive through repetition of fearful identity. Every time you respond as the overwhelmed version of yourself automatically, the brain strengthens that pathway. But every time you consciously choose a calmer identity, even briefly, you interrupt the old conditioning and strengthen new emotional pathways instead. This is how mental freedom begins growing. Not through pretending fear does not exist, but through refusing to let fear define your entire self-image. And over time, this changes your relationship with discomfort completely. You stop seeing anxiety as proof that you are weak. You begin seeing it as a temporary nervous system response that you are capable of moving through. That subtle mindset shift creates enormous emotional resilience, because now fear no longer automatically controls your identity. You start trusting yourself more. You stop catastrophizing every emotional sensation. You stop assuming panic means danger. You begin realizing your nervous system can feel discomfort without collapsing. That realization creates quiet confidence, the kind that does not need to be loud because it is built through awareness instead of performance. And the beautiful thing about this process is that your strongest identity already exists within you. Anxiety may have buried it beneath years of fear conditioning, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion, but it never disappeared completely. Every time you choose awareness over panic, compassion over self-criticism, grounding over spiraling, you reconnect with that deeper version of yourself again. The version capable of calm energy. The version capable of emotional mastery. The version capable of sitting with uncertainty without immediately breaking apart internally. And slowly, the more often you reconnect with that identity, the more natural it begins feeling. Your brain adapts. Your nervous system learns. The anxious pathways weaken while calmer pathways strengthen through repetition. This is why healing is not about becoming someone entirely different. It is about remembering who you are underneath the fear. Because anxiety often creates emotional amnesia, it makes you forget your resilience, forget your strength, forget your ability to survive difficult moments. The Batman effect reminds you that your mind responds powerfully to the identity you choose to embody internally. And once you begin reclaiming that identity consciously, another important realization quietly begins unfolding beneath the surface. Because stepping outside anxious thinking is not only about changing how you see yourself, it is also about changing the physical patterns your body has practiced for years every time stress, fear, and emotional tension take control. The anxious mind is addicted to certainty. It wants guarantees before action, reassurance before peace, answers before calm, control before trust. It constantly asks impossible questions. What if something goes wrong? What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if I lose control? And because life can never fully answer those questions with complete certainty, anxiety keeps the nervous system trapped in endless preparation mode, endlessly scanning for danger, endlessly rehearsing future disasters that may never happen. This is why overthinking becomes so exhausting. You are trying to solve uncertainty before life even unfolds. And no matter how much thinking you do, the mind keeps demanding more certainty. One answer creates another fear. One reassurance creates another doubt. One solved problem creates another imagined catastrophe. Anxiety survives by convincing you that certainty equals safety. But certainty is not safety. Control is not peace. And perhaps one of the most powerful mindset shifts in the healing journey happens the moment you realize that emotional freedom does not come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from learning how to exist peacefully even when uncertainty remains. Because uncertainty is not a flaw in life. It is life itself. Every relationship contains uncertainty. Every opportunity contains uncertainty. Every future decision contains uncertainty. Even tomorrow itself is uncertain. Yet the anxious brain treats uncertainty like danger. It reacts to the unknown as though survival is under threat. Your body tightens. Your thoughts accelerate. Your nervous system prepares for emotional impact before anything has actually happened. And over time, this creates a painful habit loop where your mind begins avoiding uncertainty at all costs. You overprepare. You overanalyze. You seek constant reassurance. You replay conversations repeatedly. You mentally rehearse future situations over and over again. Not because you are weak, but because your brain learned to associate uncertainty with emotional danger. And maybe you know exactly what that feels like. The inability to relax while waiting for an answer. The need to check your phone repeatedly. The urge to predict every possible outcome before making a decision. The exhaustion of trying to mentally control situations that are ultimately uncontrollable. Anxiety convinces you that if you think enough, prepare enough, worry enough, you can prevent pain completely. But the truth is, constant mental control does not create peace. It creates emotional burnout. Because your nervous system was never designed to live in nonstop future prediction. This is why learning to tolerate uncertainty becomes such a transformative part of mental rewiring. It teaches your brain a completely different emotional lesson. Instead of constantly demanding guarantees before calmness, you begin teaching your nervous system that uncertainty itself is survivable. That changes everything. Because now your emotional stability no longer depends entirely on controlling the future. You start understanding something deeply important. The goal is not to become certain about everything. The goal is to become resilient enough to handle uncertainty without collapsing into fear. That is emotional mastery. And emotional mastery begins in small moments. Moments where you resist the urge to seek reassurance immediately. Moments where you allow unanswered questions to exist temporarily. Moments where you stop overanalyzing every possible outcome. Moments where you choose presence instead of prediction. At first, this can feel incredibly uncomfortable because the anxious brain interprets uncertainty as unsafe. The body may react intensely. Your mind may scream for answers. You may feel emotional tension rising inside your chest. But if you stay present without immediately escaping into overthinking, something powerful begins happening. The nervous system slowly adapts. Your brain learns that uncertainty does not automatically destroy you. That discomfort can rise and fall naturally without needing immediate control. This is how anxiety pathways weaken, not by avoiding uncertainty forever, but by experiencing uncertainty without feeding panic every single time. Imagine standing at the edge of a cold ocean. At first, the water feels shocking, uncomfortable, overwhelming. But the longer you remain present, the more your body adjusts. Uncertainty works the same way emotionally. The anxious mind wants immediate escape because discomfort feels intense at first. But healing requires teaching the brain that discomfort is temporary, manageable, survivable. This creates deep emotional resilience because now your peace is not constantly dependent on external certainty. You stop needing perfect outcomes before allowing yourself to breathe. You stop demanding guarantees before taking action. You stop postponing your life while waiting for fear to disappear completely. And perhaps that is one of anxiety's greatest tricks. It convinces you that life can only begin once uncertainty is gone. But uncertainty never disappears fully. So many people spend years trapped in emotional waiting rooms, waiting to finally feel certain enough, confident enough, fearless enough to truly live. Meanwhile, life continues moving forward. Healing begins when you stop waiting for certainty and start building trust in yourself instead. Trust that you can handle difficult emotions. Trust that uncertainty is part of growth. Trust that fear does not always predict danger. Trust that your nervous system is capable of adapting. This creates a powerful internal shift because now your mind stops viewing uncertainty as proof of catastrophe. Instead, uncertainty becomes something you can move through with awareness. And strangely enough, once you stop fighting uncertainty so aggressively, your mind becomes quieter. The constant mental checking softens. The obsessive thinking slows down. The emotional urgency loses intensity. You stop chasing impossible control all day long. That creates space for the present moment again. You begin noticing simple things more clearly. Your breathing, your surroundings, conversations, silence, sunlight through a window. The feeling of being alive right now instead of mentally trapped inside imagined futures. This is where inner peace quietly begins returning. Not because the future suddenly became predictable, but because your relationship with unpredictability changed. And perhaps this is the deeper truth anxiety tries to hide from you. Your strength was never meant to come from controlling every outcome. Your strength comes from learning that you can remain grounded even when life feels uncertain. That realization creates quiet confidence. Not loud confidence built on perfection. Real confidence built on adaptability. You stop seeing uncertainty as an enemy and begin seeing it as part of the human experience itself. Every meaningful thing in life requires stepping into some form of unknown. Love, growth, change, healing, creativity, vulnerability. None of these arrive with complete guarantees. And yet life becomes richer the moment you stop demanding certainty before allowing yourself to participate fully in it. This does not mean anxiety disappears overnight. The mind may still drift toward fearful predictions sometimes. Your nervous system may still react strongly in uncertain moments. But now you understand something your anxious brain never fully understood before. Discomfort is not danger. Uncertainty is not catastrophe, and fear is not prophecy. That understanding creates profound psychological freedom because now you no longer need to spend every waking moment trying to outthink the future. You begin reclaiming energy that anxiety stole through endless mental rehearsal and prediction. Your mind becomes softer. Your body becomes calmer. Your thoughts become less aggressive. And in those quieter moments, another deeper realization slowly starts emerging beneath the surface. Because once you stop fighting uncertainty constantly, you finally begin noticing how much of your anxiety was never truly about the future itself, but about the hidden fear of not being able to trust your own ability to handle whatever life eventually brings. Anxiety becomes terrifying when it feels like you. That is the hidden trap most people never realize they are living inside. The thoughts feel personal. The panic feels personal. The overthinking feels personal. Every intrusive fear starts sounding like your real voice, your real identity, your real truth. And after enough repetition, you stop saying, "I am experiencing anxiety." Instead, you begin saying, "This is just who I am." That belief creates emotional imprisonment. Because once anxiety becomes fused with your identity, every fearful thought feels permanent, every emotional spiral feels defining, and every difficult moment feels like proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. The anxious brain loves this fusion because the more personally you identify with fear, the harder it becomes to separate yourself from the emotional chaos happening inside your mind. This is why externalization becomes such a powerful turning point in healing. Because externalization teaches you something the anxious brain desperately tries to hide from you. You are not your anxiety. You are not your intrusive thoughts. You are not the catastrophic stories your mind creates at 3 in the morning. You are the awareness observing them. And the moment you begin separating yourself from anxiety psychologically, your emotional relationship with fear starts changing completely. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with rocks for years without realizing you could remove it. That is what anxious identification feels like. You carry every fearful thought as though it defines your character, your future, your capability, your worth. But externalization creates distance, and distance creates breathing room inside the nervous system. Instead of saying, "I'm broken," you begin saying, "My anxiety is making me feel broken right now." Instead of saying, "I'm a failure," you begin saying, "My anxious mind is telling me a fear-based story." That subtle shift may sound small, but emotionally it changes everything because now fear is no longer your identity. It becomes an experience moving through your awareness instead. And once anxiety stops feeling like your identity, it starts losing some of its emotional authority over you. Because the anxious brain often behaves like an overprotective alarm system. It constantly searches for danger, exaggerates uncertainty, predicts emotional pain, and creates endless warnings inside your mind. But just because an alarm goes off does not mean the building is actually burning. The mind can produce fear without reality matching the fear itself. This is why externalization creates mental clarity. It helps you recognize anxiety as a pattern instead of a personal truth. Suddenly, you begin noticing how often fear speaks in dramatic extremes. Something terrible is going to happen. You can't handle this. Everyone is judging you. You'll never feel normal again. The anxious brain speaks with emotional intensity because intensity captures your attention quickly. But intensity is not evidence. Fear is not prophecy. And once you learn to separate your observing self from the anxious voice, your nervous system starts calming down in ways that once felt impossible. Imagine sitting beside a loud radio instead of believing you are the radio itself. The noise may still exist temporarily, but now you understand something important. You do not have to become every thought you hear. That realization creates profound emotional freedom because anxious people often spend years fighting their thoughts directly, trying to eliminate every intrusive fear completely. But fighting thoughts aggressively can actually strengthen them because the brain interprets resistance as proof the thoughts are dangerous. Externalization changes the approach completely. Instead of becoming trapped inside the thought, you observe it. You notice it. You label it. You create psychological space around it. My anxiety is catastrophizing again. My fear response is becoming activated. My overthinking mind is trying to predict the future. This creates calm thinking because awareness interrupts emotional fusion. Suddenly, your nervous system no longer reacts with the same level of panic because the thought is no longer defining your identity completely. And perhaps one of the most healing aspects of externalization is the compassion it creates. Many anxious people secretly attack themselves every single day. They judge themselves for overthinking. They criticize themselves for panic. They feel ashamed of their emotional sensitivity. But once you begin externalizing anxiety, you stop viewing yourself as the enemy. You realize your brain learned these patterns through stress, fear conditioning, emotional experiences, survival habits, and repeated nervous system activation. Anxiety was not randomly chosen by you. It developed gradually through repetition and adaptation. That understanding softens self-hatred, and healing becomes possible the moment self-hatred weakens. Because true emotional mastery cannot grow inside constant self-attack. The nervous system heals through safety, awareness, patience, and compassionate rewiring. Externalization creates that safety internally. It reminds you that underneath the anxiety, there is still a deeper self untouched by panic. A calmer awareness still exists beneath the noise. Anxiety may temporarily cloud your perception, but it does not erase your value, your strength, or your capacity to heal. And once you reconnect with that deeper awareness, something remarkable starts happening. The emotional storms become less consuming. The thoughts still appear sometimes, but they no longer completely own your attention. You stop chasing every intrusive fear. You stop arguing endlessly with every catastrophic prediction. Instead, you observe. You breathe. You return to the present moment. This is psychological freedom. Not the complete disappearance of anxious thoughts forever, but the ability to experience thoughts without losing yourself inside them. And slowly, your nervous system begins learning a new pattern. The moment fear appears, you no longer instantly collapse into panic. You recognize the anxious voice for what it is, a conditioned mental response trying to protect you through prediction and control. That awareness weakens the anxiety loop dramatically. Because anxiety feeds on unconscious identification. The more personally you take every fear, the stronger the loop becomes. But when you externalize anxiety, you stop feeding the cycle automatically. You create space between stimulus and reaction. You give your mind the opportunity to respond consciously instead of impulsively. This changes your emotional energy completely. Your thoughts slow down. Your breathing deepens. Your body softens. The mental chaos begins losing intensity. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you begin realizing that peace is not something you must chase endlessly outside yourself. Peace begins emerging naturally the moment you stop treating every anxious thought like absolute truth. That realization creates quiet confidence because now you understand something deeply important. You can experience fear without becoming fear. You can experience anxiety without losing your identity. You can experience uncertainty without emotionally disappearing inside it. And as this understanding grows stronger, another deeper layer of healing quietly begins unfolding beneath the surface. Because once you stop identifying completely with anxious thoughts, you finally become capable of examining the physical sensations, emotional reactions, and nervous system habits that anxiety has been using to keep the cycle alive for so many years. Your mind is not just thinking, it is connecting. Every fear, every memory, every intrusive thought, every emotional trigger creates invisible pathways inside your brain, and over time those pathways become maps. Some maps lead toward calm thinking, emotional resilience, and inner peace. Others lead toward panic, overthinking, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. The problem is that most anxious people never actually see the map they are following. They only feel the chaos of being trapped inside it. And that is why anxiety can feel so overwhelming. One thought leads to another thought, then another fear, then another prediction, then another emotional reaction, until suddenly your mind feels like a crowded storm moving in every direction at once. You try to calm yourself down, but the thoughts keep branching outward endlessly. You try to focus, but your attention gets pulled into dozens of emotional pathways at the same time. This is where mind mapping becomes powerful, because healing often begins the moment you stop treating anxiety like random chaos and start recognizing the hidden patterns underneath it. The anxious brain loves confusion because confusion keeps you emotionally reactive. But the moment you slow down enough to map your thoughts clearly, your nervous system begins moving from panic toward awareness. And awareness changes everything. Imagine standing above a maze instead of running blindly inside it. Suddenly the pathways become visible. Suddenly you understand where the spirals begin, where the triggers connect, where the emotional loops repeat themselves over and over again. That is what mind mapping does emotionally. It allows you to step outside the storm long enough to observe the structure of your anxiety instead of drowning inside it unconsciously. Because anxiety is rarely just one isolated thought. A simple situation can activate an entire chain reaction inside the mind. You receive a short message from someone. Your brain immediately interprets it negatively. Then fear appears. Then overthinking begins. Then your body reacts physically. Then catastrophic thinking expands the situation further. Then emotional exhaustion arrives. All of this can happen within seconds. And if you never pause to examine the map, the cycle keeps repeating automatically. This is why anxious people often feel mentally trapped. The brain keeps following familiar emotional routes because those routes have been reinforced through repetition for years. The nervous system learns patterns quickly. If your mind repeatedly connects uncertainty with danger, silence with rejection, mistakes with failure, or discomfort with catastrophe, those pathways strengthen until they become automatic. But automatic does not mean permanent. The brain can rewire. And rewiring starts with awareness. Mind mapping helps you uncover the emotional architecture beneath your anxiety. Instead of saying, "I'm anxious for no reason," you begin understanding the deeper chain underneath the emotion. You notice the trigger. You notice the interpretation. You notice the fear response. You notice the behavioral pattern. You notice the emotional outcome. And once you see the map clearly, you finally gain the ability to interrupt the cycle consciously. This creates mental clarity because anxious thoughts lose some of their power once they become visible. Fear thrives in emotional fog, but awareness brings structure into the chaos. Imagine writing one anxious thought in the center of a page. What if I fail? Then around it, you begin tracing the connected fears. If I fail, people will judge me. If people judge me, I'll feel rejected. If I feel rejected, I'll feel worthless. Suddenly you realize the anxiety was never only about failure. Beneath the surface, the nervous system was protecting deeper fears connected to identity, belonging, and emotional safety. This realization becomes transformative because now you are no longer fighting random symptoms blindly. You are understanding the emotional roots beneath them. And understanding creates power, not power through control, but power through self-awareness. The anxious brain often reacts automatically because it has never been taught to pause and observe itself compassionately. But the moment you begin mapping your internal patterns, your relationship with anxiety changes. Instead of feeling possessed by fear, you begin studying it calmly. That calm observation weakens emotional reactivity. Because your brain starts moving away from survival mode and toward conscious awareness. And perhaps one of the most healing parts of mind mapping is realizing how repetitive many anxious loops actually are. At first, anxiety feels endless and unpredictable, but once you begin observing your patterns carefully, you notice familiar themes repeating again and again. The same fears, the same assumptions, the same catastrophic predictions, the same emotional spirals. And strangely enough, this realization becomes comforting because now anxiety feels less mysterious. You begin understanding that your mind is not randomly broken. It is following learned emotional routes that can be changed. This is where the healing journey becomes deeply empowering. Because once you recognize the map, you can begin creating new pathways intentionally. Instead of reinforcing panic automatically, you start practicing calm thinking consciously. You challenge distorted interpretations. You slow down catastrophic assumptions. You reconnect with the present moment. You breathe through uncertainty instead of escaping it. Each of these responses creates new emotional pathways inside the brain. This is brain rewiring happening in real time. At first, the new pathways feel unfamiliar because anxious habits have existed for so long. The brain naturally returns toward familiar emotional roads, even painful ones. But repetition changes the nervous system gradually. Every time you choose awareness over automatic panic, you strengthen emotional resilience slightly more. And over time, the mental map itself begins changing. The old anxiety routes weaken from disuse. The new calm pathways strengthen through repetition. That is how psychological freedom slowly develops. Not through perfection, not through eliminating every fearful thought forever, but through repeatedly guiding the mind toward healthier emotional patterns until peace begins feeling more familiar than chaos. And something beautiful starts happening during this process. You stop fearing your own mind so intensely. You begin trusting your awareness again. You realize that thoughts are not controlling you as completely as they once did, because now you can see the pathways forming before the emotional spiral fully takes over. That creates quiet confidence. You feel less emotionally ambushed by your own thinking, less trapped inside mental noise, less consumed by unconscious fear loops. Your inner world becomes more spacious, more grounded, more understandable. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, your mind no longer feels like an enemy you must constantly battle. It becomes something you can observe, understand, and gradually reshape with patience. This is where emotional mastery begins growing quietly beneath the surface. Not through force, but through awareness. Not through suppression, but through understanding. Because once you can see the map clearly, you finally realize something the anxious brain tried to hide from you for years. You are not lost inside your mind. You are learning how to navigate it. And as your awareness deepens even further, another important realization slowly starts emerging beneath the surface. Because many of the strongest anxiety pathways are not only connected to thoughts themselves, but also to the emotional habits your brain learned through repeated fear, avoidance, and survival behaviors over the course of your life. Anxiety loves indecision. It feeds on hesitation, uncertainty, second-guessing, and endless mental rehearsal. The anxious brain constantly whispers, "What if you make the wrong choice?" And once that fear takes hold, your mind begins spinning in circles, replaying possibilities, predicting disasters, analyzing outcomes over and over again until even small decisions start feeling emotionally exhausting. You may have felt this more times than you can count. Standing in front of a simple choice while your mind creates 10 different future scenarios. Replaying conversations after speaking. Questioning whether you said the right thing, chose the right path, trusted the right person. Even after making a decision, the anxious brain keeps reopening the case internally, searching for mistakes, hidden dangers, or imagined consequences. This is how overthinking steals peace. Not because decisions themselves are always dangerous, but because the anxious mind treats uncertainty like an emergency. It believes every choice must be perfect in order for you to feel safe emotionally. And once perfection becomes the requirement, decision-making becomes terrifying. But life was never designed to be lived through perfect certainty. No human being can predict every outcome. No person can eliminate all risk. No mind can guarantee complete control over the future. Yet anxiety keeps trying anyway. And that endless attempt to control every possibility creates mental exhaustion, emotional paralysis, and constant inner tension. This is why better decision-making leads to less anxiety. Not because perfect decisions eliminate discomfort forever, but because healthier thinking changes your relationship with uncertainty itself. The moment you stop demanding impossible certainty before acting, your nervous system begins calming down in ways that once felt unreachable. Because strong decision-making is not about always being right. It is about trusting yourself enough to move forward even when outcomes remain uncertain. That trust changes everything. The anxious brain often believes anxiety comes from external situations alone, but much of anxiety actually comes from distrust in your own ability to handle life. Deep beneath overthinking is often a hidden fear that says, "What if I can't cope if things go wrong?" And once that fear takes over, the mind starts obsessing over decisions constantly because it believes every choice carries catastrophic emotional consequences. But emotionally resilient people think differently. They understand something the anxious mind forgets. A wrong decision is rarely the end of your story. You can adapt. You can recover. You can learn. You can redirect your path if needed. That understanding creates quiet confidence because now decisions stop feeling like life or death emotional threats. They become experiences instead of identity-defining disasters. And perhaps this is one of the biggest mindset shifts in the healing journey. The goal is not to eliminate mistakes completely. The goal is to stop fearing mistakes so intensely that you become trapped in endless mental paralysis. Because overthinking often disguises itself as preparation. The mind says, "I'm just trying to make the best choice." But many times, anxiety is not searching for the best choice. It is searching for emotional guarantees that do not exist. That search never ends. You analyze one possibility, then another possibility appears. You solve one concern, then the mind creates another fear immediately afterward. Eventually, your thoughts become so crowded that your nervous system loses access to calm thinking entirely. This is why mentally exhausted people often struggle making even small decisions. Their brains are overloaded from nonstop prediction and analysis. But clarity returns the moment you simplify the process. Better decision-making starts when you stop asking, "How do I avoid every possible negative outcome?" and begin asking, "What choice aligns most closely with my values, my growth, and my present awareness right now?" That question brings you back into the present moment instead of trapping you inside imagined futures endlessly. Because anxiety constantly pulls your attention into hypothetical timelines. What if this happens next month? What if this choice ruins everything? What if I regret this later? But life can only be lived from where you are now. And often, the healthiest decision is not the one that guarantees comfort immediately. It is the one that moves you toward emotional growth instead of fear-based avoidance. This becomes especially important because anxious people often build their lives around avoiding discomfort. They avoid conversations, opportunities, relationships, risks, boundaries, vulnerability, and change because the nervous system associates uncertainty with danger. But avoidance strengthens anxiety. Every avoided situation teaches the brain that fear was necessary for survival. And over time, your world becomes smaller. Your confidence weakens. Your nervous system becomes increasingly reactive. Better decision-making interrupts this cycle by teaching your brain a new emotional lesson. It teaches you that discomfort does not always mean danger. Sometimes discomfort is simply the feeling of growth happening. That realization creates emotional resilience. Because now you stop measuring every decision by how comfortable it feels emotionally in the moment. Instead, you begin measuring decisions by whether they move you toward healing, authenticity, and inner peace long-term. And slowly, your relationship with mistakes changes too. You stop catastrophizing every imperfect outcome. You stop viewing setbacks as proof of failure. You stop attacking yourself every time life unfolds differently than expected. This creates mental freedom because the anxious brain no longer has to carry the impossible burden of predicting and controlling everything constantly. You begin allowing life to breathe again. You make decisions more calmly. You recover from mistakes more gently. You trust your adaptability more deeply. And perhaps one of the most beautiful parts of this process is realizing that peace does not come from always choosing perfectly. Peace comes from learning how to remain grounded even when life feels uncertain. That grounded energy changes your nervous system profoundly. Your thoughts become less frantic. Your body softens. Your emotional reactions lose some intensity. The mind stops spiraling endlessly through every possible future scenario. Instead of freezing in fear, you begin responding with awareness. That awareness creates calm energy because now you understand something the anxious brain spent years trying to hide from you. No decision can fully protect you from all discomfort in life, but your ability to handle discomfort can absolutely grow stronger. And once you begin trusting your resilience instead of obsessing over perfect outcomes, anxiety starts losing one of its strongest sources of control over your mind. You stop needing certainty before action. You stop demanding guarantees before growth. You stop postponing your life while waiting for fear to disappear completely. That is where psychological freedom quietly begins emerging, not in controlling every outcome, but in realizing you are capable of navigating uncertainty with increasing emotional strength, wisdom, and self-trust. And as this deeper trust continues growing inside you, another important transformation slowly begins unfolding beneath the surface. Because once decision-making becomes calmer and less fear-driven, you finally create enough mental space to notice how your daily habits, routines, and emotional behaviors have been shaping your anxious brain all along. What if the very thing you spent years fighting could become the source of your greatest emotional strength? What if your anxious brain, the same mind that overthinks, worries, analyzes, predicts, and feels everything so deeply, also carries hidden abilities that most people never fully develop? Because anxiety is painful, exhausting, and overwhelming at times, but beneath the chaos there is often heightened awareness, emotional sensitivity, intuition, creativity, empathy, deep thinking, and the ability to notice details other people completely miss. The problem is not always that your mind feels deeply. The problem is that your mind has been trained to fear its own sensitivity. And once fear takes control of sensitivity, anxiety begins turning every strength inward against you. Your awareness becomes overthinking. Your imagination becomes catastrophic thinking. Your emotional depth becomes emotional exhaustion. Your attention to detail becomes perfectionism. Your protective instincts become fear loops. But when awareness enters the process, something powerful begins changing. The same brain that once created chaos can begin creating clarity. The same emotional intensity that once overwhelmed you can become emotional intelligence. The same sensitivity that once caused suffering can become a source of connection, intuition, compassion, and strength. This is where the healing journey shifts completely. You stop viewing yourself as broken and begin recognizing that your anxious brain may simply be untrained, overstimulated, emotionally overloaded, and stuck inside survival mode for too long. Because many anxious people are not weak at all. They are deeply aware people trapped inside hyperactive nervous systems. You notice energy quickly. You sense tension quickly. You think deeply. You care deeply. You process life intensely. And while that intensity can feel exhausting when unmanaged, it can also become incredibly powerful once emotional mastery begins developing. Imagine a fire. Uncontrolled, it destroys everything around it. Directed properly, it creates warmth, energy, movement, and transformation. Anxiety works the same way. When fear controls your nervous system, the emotional energy burns chaotically. But when awareness, mindfulness, and self-regulation enter the process, that same energy can become focus, motivation, intuition, empathy, creativity, and resilience. This is why healing is not about becoming emotionless. It is about learning how to guide your emotional energy instead of being controlled by it constantly. And perhaps this is one of the most important mindset shifts in the entire healing journey. You stop asking, how do I get rid of every anxious feeling forever? And begin asking, how do I build a healthier relationship with the mind and nervous system I already have? That question changes everything, because now healing becomes collaboration instead of self-warfare. You stop attacking yourself for being sensitive. You stop shaming yourself for feeling deeply. You stop seeing your emotional intensity as weakness. Instead, you begin learning how to regulate it, channel it, and understand it. This creates psychological freedom because anxious people often spend years trying to become less themselves in order to feel safe. They try to numb emotions, suppress thoughts, avoid vulnerability, and disconnect from their sensitivity entirely. But numbness is not peace. Disconnection is not healing. True healing happens when you learn how to remain emotionally open without becoming emotionally consumed. And slowly, you begin noticing how many hidden strengths anxiety forced you to develop over time. You become highly self-aware. You learn emotional observation. You develop empathy for struggling people. You notice patterns quickly. You become capable of deep reflection and personal growth. You begin understanding human emotions in ways many people never do. The anxious healing journey often creates extraordinary emotional wisdom because you are forced to study the mind deeply in order to survive your own internal storms. And once you stop viewing your anxiety only as an enemy, you begin reclaiming those hidden strengths. Your overthinking transforms into deep thinking. Your emotional sensitivity transforms into compassion. Your nervous energy transforms into focused action. Your self-awareness transforms into emotional intelligence. This is brain rewiring happening on a deeper level because now your mind is no longer trapped entirely inside fear-based identity. Instead of constantly saying, "Something is wrong with me," you begin realizing, "My mind learned survival patterns that can now be reshaped consciously." That realization creates hope. Real hope. Not fake positivity. Not forced optimism. The quiet kind of hope that comes from understanding you are capable of transformation. And transformation begins through small, consistent moments. Moments where you breathe instead of panic. Moments where you observe instead of catastrophize. Moments where you rest instead of overworking your nervous system. Moments where you trust yourself instead of seeking endless reassurance. Each of those moments strengthens new emotional pathways. Each moment teaches your brain that peace is possible. And gradually, your relationship with anxiety changes completely. You stop fearing every sensation. You stop running from every uncomfortable thought. You stop believing that emotional intensity automatically means danger. Instead, you begin developing calm energy within discomfort itself. That is emotional resilience. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to remain grounded while fear passes through your nervous system temporarily. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this entire healing journey is realizing that your anxious brain was never trying to destroy you completely. In its own imperfect way, it was trying to protect you, prepare you, and keep you emotionally safe. The problem was never protection itself. The problem was that survival mode became permanent. But now awareness is changing the pattern. Now mindfulness is calming the storm. Now emotional mastery is replacing emotional chaos. And slowly, the mind that once felt like a prison begins becoming a place of understanding, growth, and inner peace instead. You start trusting yourself again. You start reconnecting with your present moment instead of living entirely inside fearful futures. You begin experiencing silence without panic. You begin feeling calm without immediately waiting for disaster. That is where the true superpower appears, not in becoming fearless, but in becoming deeply aware, emotionally resilient, compassionate, adaptable, and capable of transforming pain into wisdom. Because the people who have walked through anxiety consciously often develop extraordinary depth. They learn how fragile the human mind can feel, but they also learn how strong the human spirit can become. And as this deeper emotional strength continues unfolding within you, another realization quietly waits beneath the surface. Because once you stop seeing anxiety only as something to escape from, you finally become ready to understand how lasting peace is created not through fighting your mind endlessly, but through building a completely new relationship with yourself altogether. And now, as this journey slowly comes to rest, you may begin noticing something different inside yourself. Not because every anxious thought has disappeared forever, not because life suddenly became completely predictable, but because your relationship with your mind has started changing in ways that once felt impossible. The noise may still appear sometimes. The fear may still visit unexpectedly. The overthinking may still try pulling you back into old survival patterns. But now you understand something you did not fully understand before. You are not powerless against your own mind. For so long, anxiety may have convinced you that you were trapped inside endless loops, trapped inside intrusive thoughts, trapped inside emotional chaos, trapped inside fear responses that controlled your entire nervous system. But throughout this healing journey, piece by piece, you have started seeing how awareness changes everything. You have seen how thought patterns can be challenged, how emotional reactions can be softened, how mindfulness can interrupt fear loops, how cognitive reframing can reshape perception, and how calm thinking can slowly rewire an anxious brain from the inside out. That transformation does not happen overnight. It happens quietly, slowly, moment by moment, breath by breath, choice by choice. Every time you pause before reacting emotionally, your brain changes a little. Every time you question catastrophic thinking instead of blindly believing it, your brain changes a little. Every time you sit with uncertainty instead of running from it, your brain changes a little. Every time you choose self-compassion over self-attack, your nervous system learns safety again. This is what true brain rewiring looks like in real life. Not perfection, not instant healing, but steady emotional growth that slowly transforms chaos into calm. And perhaps one of the most powerful realizations from this entire experience is understanding that anxiety was never simply about thoughts alone. It was about the relationship you developed with fear, uncertainty, control, self-trust, and emotional safety. Once that relationship begins healing, your entire internal world starts shifting naturally. You stop needing to fight every thought. You stop treating every emotion like an emergency. You stop believing that fear always means danger. Instead, you begin responding with awareness instead of panic. That awareness creates mental clarity. That clarity creates emotional resilience. And emotional resilience creates peace that no external situation can fully take away from you. Because real inner peace is not the absence of difficult emotions. It is the ability to remain grounded while emotions move through you naturally, without controlling your entire identity. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you can now imagine what life feels like beyond survival mode. A life where your mornings are not ruled entirely by fear. A life where your nervous system does not constantly expect disaster. A life where your thoughts no longer dominate every quiet moment. A life where your mind becomes a place of calm energy instead of constant emotional warfare. That future is possible, not because you suddenly become fearless, but because you become stronger than the patterns that once controlled you unconsciously. You become more self-aware, more emotionally intelligent, more grounded, more compassionate toward yourself. And slowly, your anxious brain stops feeling like an enemy and starts becoming something you finally understand with patience and wisdom. This is the healing journey, not becoming someone else, but reconnecting with yourself beneath the fear. Because beneath the overthinking, beneath the intrusive thoughts, beneath the panic loops, beneath the emotional exhaustion, there has always been a calmer version of you waiting patiently underneath the noise. A version of you capable of quiet confidence, emotional mastery, present moment awareness, and deep psychological freedom. And from this moment forward, every small step you take toward mindfulness, self-regulation, emotional balance, and cognitive reset continues strengthening that calmer version of yourself. Even on difficult days, even during setbacks, even when progress feels slow, healing is still happening beneath the surface. Your nervous system is learning. Your mind is adapting. Your emotional world is evolving. And one day, you will look back and realize that the person who once felt completely trapped by anxiety slowly became someone capable of facing life with more calm, clarity, courage, and inner peace than they ever believed possible. So as this journey gently comes to an end, carry this truth with you. You are not your worst thoughts. You are not your panic. You are not your fear loops. You are a human being learning how to heal, learning how to breathe again, learning how to trust yourself again, and learning how to live fully in the present moment instead of constantly fearing the future. And if this audiobook helped you understand your mind a little better, helped you feel less alone in your healing journey, or helped you take even one step toward mental freedom and emotional resilience, then take a moment to support this journey forward. Like this audiobook, share it with someone who may be silently struggling with anxiety or overthinking, and subscribe to Cliff Note Chronicles for more self-help audiobooks, calming affirmations, mindfulness journeys, emotional healing content, and powerful tools to help you rewire your thinking and unlock a more peaceful mindset. Because your healing journey does not end here. In many ways, this is only the moment where your new relationship with yourself truly begins.